A bear begs for help from a female soldier in the forest. You won't believe what happens next. The morning mist hung thickly in the Virginia wilderness as Staff Sergeant Evelyn Harper adjusted her backpack, her boots crunching softly against the frost-covered leaves. She had taken this leave to find solace in nature, hoping to silence the echoes of the battlefield that haunted her dreams. The stillness of the forest was interrupted by a low, guttural sound. A bear. But what made her stop mid-step wasn't fear. It was the sight of the massive creature standing on its hind legs, its paw extended toward her. The bear's eyes, deep pools of amber, seemed to plead for something. Evelyn froze. This wasn't an attack, it was a cry for help. Evelyn's instinct was to reach for her sidearm, but something in the bear's demeanor stopped her. Its massive frame was trembling, and she noticed a deep gash along its shoulder, bleeding profusely. A lump formed in her throat. She had seen that same desperation on the battlefield, men and women clinging to life, their eyes begging for someone to save them. Slowly, she knelt, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to the bear or herself. Her mind raced. This was no ordinary encounter. Evelyn had spent years in combat zones, her hands trained to heal wounds and fire weapons. Yet here, in the heart of this forest, she was confronted by a creature that seemed to defy the primal divide between man and beast. Was she losing her mind? Was this some manifestation of her PTSD? She pushed the doubts aside as the bear dropped to all fours, whimpering softly, its gaze fixed on her. Reaching for the first aid kit in her bag, Evelyn moved cautiously closer. The bear didn't flinch. Instead, it sat back on its haunches, allowing her a better view of the wound. It was deep, likely caused by a hunter's trap or its rival animal. Evelyn's hands trembled as she cleaned the injury, her voice breaking the silence. "You're lucky I'm not running," she muttered, half smiling. The bear blinked slowly, almost as if acknowledging her words. As she worked, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was more than chance. The bond forming between her and the animal felt like a bridge across two worlds, one of instinct, the other of reason. When she finished bandaging the wound, the bear leaned its massive head toward her, pressing gently against her shoulder. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost: purpose. Evelyn sat on a fallen log, her hands shaking from the adrenaline. The bear lay a few feet away, its breathing heavy but steady. She could still feel the weight of its head against her shoulder, a strange and unexpected gesture that lingered in her mind. The forest around them seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself had paused to observe this unlikely encounter. Evelyn glanced at the animal again, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing out here, big guy?" The bear shifted slightly, exposing more of its wounded side. Evelyn could see now that the injury wasn't just deep, it was infected. She cursed under her breath, realizing the first aid she'd offered was only a temporary fix. "You're not going to make it unless I help you," she said aloud, half expecting to hear the bear respond. Instead, it let out a low rumble, a sound that felt more like agreement than aggression. The soldier in Evelyn took over. She rummaged through her pack, retrieving her small survival kit. "Okay, let's see what we're working with." Her voice steadied as she listed what she needed: antibiotics, clean bandages, and food. She had the basics, but the nearest ranger station was miles away. Could she leave the bear? Could she risk trusting that it would still be here when she returned? The bear, as if sensing her hesitation, shifted closer, its amber eyes locking onto hers. Evelyn felt a pang of guilt, the kind she hadn't felt since her days in Iraq, when leaving someone behind was sometimes the only option. But this time, she had a choice. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision. "All right, we're in this together," she said, her tone firm. She began to set up a small camp, gathering branches to build a fire. As the flames grew, their warmth seemed to calm both Evelyn and the bear. She opened a ration pack, tearing off small pieces of jerky to offer it. To her surprise, the bear took the food gently, its massive jaws careful not to graze her hand. Sitting beside the creature under the flickering firelight, Evelyn felt a strange sense of camaraderie. Whatever had brought them together, she knew this was only the beginning of a journey that neither could have anticipated. Dawn broke over the forest, painting the landscape in soft hues of gold and green. Evelyn woke to the sound of rustling leaves and turned to see the bear moving awkwardly on 3 legs, avoiding putting weight on its injured side. She rubbed her eyes, still marveling at the fact that she had slept next to a wild animal without fear. "Morning, big guy," she muttered, rising to her feet. The bear sniffed the air, its ears twitching. Evelyn felt the growing urgency of their situation. The infection wouldn't wait, and neither could they. She packed her gear quickly, occasionally glancing at the bear as it watched her intently. "We're heading to the ranger station," she said, her voice taking on a commanding tone as if addressing a fellow soldier. "It's a long hike, but you'll need to trust me." As they set out, Evelyn couldn't help but reflect on how surreal her life had become. She was used to navigating unpredictable terrain, but this was different. The bear stayed close, limping behind her as she cleared paths through dense underbrush. She spoke to it as they moved, her words filling the quiet void of the forest. "You remind me of someone," she admitted softly, her thoughts drifting to a fallen comrade who had once depended on her care. Hours passed, and the weight of the journey began to take its toll. The bear's steps grew slower, and Evelyn felt a pang of fear. What if they didn't make it in time? She searched the horizon for landmarks, her heart sinking as she realized how far they still had to go. "Hang in there," she said, kneeling to check the animal's wound. The bandage was soaked through, the edges tinged with angry red. As she wrapped a fresh strip of gauze around the wound, Evelyn felt the bear's hot breath against her face. It wasn't fear she felt in that moment, but a profound connection, a silent understanding that they were relying on each other to survive. "We're close," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was a promise to the bear or herself. Rising to her feet, she pointed toward the distant hills where the ranger station awaited. "Just a little further, okay?" The sun had climbed high overhead, casting long shadows through the towering trees. Evelyn's muscles ached, and her water supply was dwindling. Every few steps, she glanced back at the bear, now visibly struggling to keep up. Its breaths came in labored puffs, each exhale a haunting reminder of how precarious their situation was. She bit her lip, trying to silence the growing doubt in her mind. "Not much farther," she said, though her voice wavered. By midday, the forest began to thin, revealing a faint dirt trail. Relief surged through Evelyn as she recognized it from the map she'd studied earlier. This path led directly to the ranger station. She turned to the bear, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "See? I told you we'd make it." The bear, however, seemed unimpressed, collapsing onto its side with a heavy thud. Panic tightened her chest. Evelyn knelt beside the animal, running her hand along its fur. The wound was worse than she had hoped, the infection spreading faster than she anticipated. Her soldier's instincts screamed at her to act, to do something, but out here, she was limited. "You can't quit now," she said firmly, her voice cracking. "We're almost there. You've come this far. Don't give up on me." The bear opened its eyes, staring at her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just an animal's gaze, it was something deeper, almost human. Evelyn shook her head, dismissing the thought. Fatigue and stress were playing tricks on her mind. She knew better than to let emotions cloud her judgment, but this wasn't just any mission. This was different. Summoning all her strength, Evelyn tied a makeshift harness around the bear's torso using the straps from her pack. She strained against its weight, inching forward with every ounce of willpower she had left. Her body screamed in protest, but she refused to stop. Finally, as the trail curved, the ranger station came into view, a small wooden structure perched on the edge of a clearing. Tears stung her eyes. They were going to make it. Evelyn stumbled into the clearing, her legs shaking under the weight of exhaustion and the bear's bulk. The sight of the ranger station, a humble cabin with weathered wood and a satellite dish on the roof, was like a beacon in the wilderness. She paused to catch her breath, her arms trembling as she gently lowered the bear onto the ground. "We're here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The cabin door creaked open, and a tall figure emerged. Ranger Tom Whitaker, a grizzled man in his 50s, squinted at the unusual pair. "What in God's name?" he muttered, his hand instinctively hovering near the radio clipped to his belt. Evelyn raised her arms, her voice urgent but calm. "It's injured. It needs help. Please, no questions, just trust me." Tom hesitated but then nodded, waving her inside. Together, they dragged the bear into the station's back room, where an old cot and a first aid kit sat waiting. Evelyn explained the situation in clipped sentences, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned and redressed the wound. Tom listened, his skepticism giving way to quiet respect as he watched her work. "This isn't your average forest wanderer," Tom said finally, his tone wary. "Bears don't just let people patch them up like this. And they definitely don't follow them for miles." Evelyn froze for a moment, his words echoing the nagging suspicion she had buried since the encounter began. "I don't know what it is," she admitted, her voice low. "But there's something about him, something I can't explain." The bear stirred, its massive frame shifting on the cot. Evelyn leaned closer, her hand resting lightly on its fur. "You're safe now," she murmured, though the words felt more like a reassurance for herself. As she sat back, exhaustion finally claimed her. Tom threw a blanket over her shoulders, his eyes lingering on the bear with a mix of awe and unease. "Whatever this is," he said softly, "you've got one hell of a story on your hands." The next morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of muffled voices. The room was bathed in soft light filtering through the station's worn curtains. She sat up quickly, her eyes darting to the cot where the bear lay. It was awake, its head resting on its paws, watching her. Relief washed over her. The infection hadn't claimed it overnight. She stepped into the main room, where Ranger Tom was speaking in a low voice into his radio. When he noticed her, he gestured for her to come closer. "I contacted Fish and Wildlife," he explained. "Told them we had an injured bear here. But," he hesitated, his brow furrowing. "They're sending someone else, a government team?" Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Government? For an injured bear?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Tom nodded. "That's what I thought. They were asking questions, strange ones, about the bear. I didn't tell them much, but they're on their way." His eyes searched hers. "What aren't you telling me?" Evelyn felt a wave of unease but shook her head. "I don't know anything more than you do," she replied, though the words felt hollow. Something about this bear, about their connection, had felt extraordinary from the start. But why would that draw government attention? As if sensing her tension, the bear let out a low growl from the back room. Moments later, a black SUV pulled into the clearing, its tires crunching against the gravel. Two men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Evelyn and Tom exchanged a glance as they approached the cabin. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, spoke first. "I'm Agent Carter. This is Agent Rourke. We're here about the bear." Evelyn crossed her arms, meeting Carter's gaze head-on. "Why does a bear warrant federal interest?" she asked, her voice firm. Carter didn't flinch. "This isn't just any bear," he said, his tone sharp. "We have reason to believe it's connected to classified research." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We need to take it with us." The words hit Evelyn like a blow. She felt an inexplicable urge to protect the animal, a fierce resolve she hadn't felt since her days in the field. "It's not going anywhere," she said, her jaw tightening. Carter's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room filled with tense silence. In the back room, the bear let out a low, guttural growl, as if it understood every word. The air in the ranger station grew heavier as Evelyn squared off with Agent Carter. Behind him, Agent Rourke surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on the door to the back room where the bear lay. Evelyn could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. "Whatever research you're talking about," she said firmly, "this bear is injured. It needs care, not captivity." Carter's expression remained impassive, but his tone carried a sharp edge. "This isn't about captivity, Sergeant Harper," he said, using her rank with deliberate precision. Evelyn stiffened, realizing they knew more about her than she expected. Carter continued, "This bear is part of an experiment, one that went off the grid months ago. If it's here, it's because something went wrong." Evelyn's mind raced. "What kind of experiment?" she demanded. Carter hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't have clearance for that information," he replied, his voice cold. "But I can tell you this, it's not just an animal. If you've interacted with it, you're already part of the situation." Tom stepped forward, his voice gruff. "You're not making sense. It's a bear. What kind of a situation are we talking about?" Rourke finally spoke, his voice quieter but no less authoritative. "The kind where it's safer for everyone if we take it now." Evelyn's resolve hardened. "No," she said, her voice steady. "This bear came to me for help. It trusted me. I'm not handing it over to a couple of suits who can't even explain why they want it." She turned to Tom. "We need to protect it until we know what's really going on." Carter sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Sergeant, you're making a mistake. You think you're helping, but you don't understand the risks." His words were interrupted by a sudden thud from the back room. All heads turned as the door creaked open, and the bear limped into view. It stood tall despite its injury, its eyes locked on Carter and Rourke. The agents froze. The bear's presence filled the room with an almost palpable energy, its amber gaze glowing faintly in the dim light. Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine as Carter took a step back, his expression shifting from calm authority to something resembling fear. "This isn't just a bear," Carter murmured, his voice trembling for the first time. The room was still, save for the bear's labored breathing. Evelyn stood between the agents and the massive creature, her instincts screaming at her to defend it. "What aren't you telling us?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Carter glanced at Rourke, then back at the bear, his stoic facade cracking. "It's not just an experiment, it's a prototype," he said finally. "A prototype for what?" Evelyn pressed, her eyes narrowing. Carter hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of his words. "For intelligence enhancement," he admitted. "This bear was part of a classified program to test cognitive and communicative advancements in wildlife. It was designed to bridge the gap between human and animal understanding, to create something more." Evelyn blinked, her mind reeling. "You're telling me this bear is, what? Smarter than the average bear?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. But even as she spoke, memories flooded back. The way the bear had extended its paw, the human-like desperation in its eyes, the strange connection she had felt. It all started to make an eerie kind of sense. Rourke stepped forward, his voice softer now. "It wasn't supposed to leave the facility. When it escaped, we thought it was lost, or dead. But if it's here, it's because it needs something." His eyes flicked to the bear, then to Evelyn. And it found you. The weight of his words sank into her chest. She turned to the bear, which was now sitting on its haunches, watching the conversation unfold. Its amber eyes glimmered with an intelligence that defied everything she thought she knew about animals. Slowly, it raised its injured paw again, this time resting it gently on her shoulder. Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew I'd help you." Carter cleared his throat, his tone regaining some of its authority. "This isn't a fairy tale, Sergeant. That bear is a liability, a danger to itself and others. It needs to come with us." Evelyn stepped back, her hand brushing against the bear's fur. "No," she said, her voice firm. "It came to me for a reason. Whatever you did to it, it's not your experiment anymore. It's alive. It deserves a choice." The room felt like it was holding its breath, the tension stretching taut between Evelyn and the agents. The bear's paw remained on her shoulder, a silent declaration of trust that neither Carter nor Rourke could deny. Evelyn looked back at the agents, her voice steady but fierce. "If this creature is as intelligent as you say, then it deserves to decide its own fate. You don't get to take that away." Carter shook his head, frustration flashing across his face. "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment, Sergeant. You don't understand the stakes here. If this bear falls into the wrong hands, it could compromise national security." Evelyn scoffed, stepping closer to him. "And whose hands are the wrong ones? Yours?" Rourke raised a hand to de-escalate the situation. "Evelyn," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we're not the villains here. The project was meant to advance understanding, not cause harm. But it was never supposed to be released into the wild. If it's out here, it's vulnerable. Others might not be as kind as you've been." The bear let out a low growl, its amber eyes narrowing at the agents. Evelyn felt its unease like an echo in her own chest. "He doesn't trust you," she said bluntly. "And frankly, neither do I." She took a deep breath, her mind racing for a plan. "If you're serious about protecting him, then back off. Let me handle this." Carter opened his mouth to argue, but Rourke placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Wait," Rourke said, his gaze fixed on the bear. "Maybe she's right." Carter glared at him, incredulous. "Are you kidding me? This is a high-risk asset." Rourke nodded, his expression resolute. "It is. But look at it, Carter. It's not just a test subject anymore. It's something else. Something we don't fully understand. Maybe she's what it needs." Evelyn watched as the agents exchanged a silent debate, their authority fracturing under the weight of the bear's presence. Finally, Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. "You want to take responsibility for it? Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But understand this. If anything goes wrong, it's on you." Evelyn nodded, relief washing over her. "I understand." She turned to the bear, her hand resting on its fur. "We're in this together now," she said softly. The bear blinked slowly, a gesture that felt like agreement. As Carter and Rourke retreated toward their SUV, Evelyn felt a new sense of purpose settle over her. The bear leaned against her, its weight grounding her as she stared out into the forest. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Evelyn felt ready to face it. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest as Evelyn and the bear stood side by side, watching the agents drive away. The distant rumble of the SUV faded, leaving only the sounds of the wilderness, rustling leaves, the chirp of birds, and the steady hum of the earth beneath their feet. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. But there was no time to linger on that. The road ahead was long, and neither of them could afford to rest yet. "All right, big guy," she murmured, her voice steady now. "Looks like we're on our own." The bear tilted its head, its amber eyes reflecting the fading light as it looked at her. Evelyn could almost feel its thoughts, the strange connection they had formed over the last few days deepening in her chest. She wasn't just protecting it anymore. She was its partner. She packed up her gear, making sure the bear's wound was still tended to. The injury was healing but slowly, and she knew they needed to find more supplies. She glanced at the horizon, where the peaks of distant mountains loomed. "We'll make it," she said, though the words felt like more of a promise to herself than the bear. "I don't know what's ahead, but I know we're in this together." The bear let out a soft grunt, as if acknowledging her words. It had come to her not out of desperation, but out of choice. Somehow, in its silent way, it had trusted her to be its protector, its ally. And Evelyn would not fail it. As they began to walk down the forest path, the weight of what lay ahead settled in Evelyn's mind. She knew there would be more challenges, more questions. There were still people out there who would want to control the bear, who would see it as nothing more than a tool. But for now, there was peace in the quiet of the woods, in the bond they had forged through shared struggle. The journey was far from over, but Evelyn no longer feared what the future held. With the bear by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. And together, they would uncover the secrets of the past, secrets that had been buried deep within the forest, waiting to be revealed. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Evelyn felt something stir within her, something that had been dormant for years. She wasn't sure what the bear had awakened in her, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The end, or perhaps the beginning of a new chapter.